Hi class, today we are going to be covering, hold on, chapter 27. Hopefully you're able to see that. All right, great. Chapter 27, which is fluid electrolyte and acid-base homeostasis. All right. So help, what is this chapter even about? This doesn't make any sense. What's fluid electrolyte, homeostasis? What is all this? Regulating the volume and composition of body fluids and balancing their pH is essential to being healthy. So we need to keep our blood a certain pH, need to have a certain amount of sodium, a certain amount of potassium, all those sort of things in order for our body processes to work properly. So it's about how our body does that. The kidneys help maintain our body's fluid balance. And this chapter explains the mechanisms that regulate the volume and distribution of our body fluids, as well as the factors that control the solutes and the pH of our body fluids. So we're going to start with the fluid compartments and how we do the homeostasis with that. Body fluid consists of not only water, but also dissolved solutes. In adults, the body fluids make up between 55 to 65% of our total body mass. Body fluids are present in two main compartments. Inside the cell, we find 2/3 of our fluid. This is called intracellular fluid, and this is the cytosol inside the cells. Outside the cells make up 1/3 of our body fluid compartments, and this area is filled with extracellular fluid. There's two components of extracellular fluid. There is interstitial fluid, which is 80% of that extracellular fluid, and that is found between the cells. Also, it's in the lymph. It includes lymph, cerebrospinal fluid, synovial fluid, vitreous humor, serous fluid, and others. And 20% of extracellular fluid is our blood plasma. So we're going to look at the three areas of intracellular fluid, interstitial fluid, and blood plasma. So you can click on the link in D2L for the anatomy overview of fluids. But here we go. This shows the male versus the females. But we have a bunch of solids in our body, and 55 to 65, or 60 as it's shown here, % of our mass is made up of the fluids. So of our fluids, 2/3 of it are intracellular fluids found inside the cells, 1/3 is extracellular fluid. The extracellular fluid is made up of interstitial fluids and all those other ones I mentioned, like the vitreous humor, the lymph, things like that. And then 20% is made up of blood plasma. There are two barriers that separate intracellular fluid, extracellular fluid, and the blood plasma. There's the plasma membrane. It separates the intercellular fluid from extracellular fluid, or from the interstitial fluid. And then the blood vessel walls divide the interstitial fluid from the blood plasma. Capillary walls are thin enough to allow exchange of water and solutes between the plasma and the interstitial fluid. So here we see the different fluids. Inside the blood capillary, we have the plasma, and then we have the barrier there. And then we have interstitial fluid found between all of these cells. And inside we have the extracellular fluid, which is, there's the barrier of the inside the cell has the intracellular fluid, and it has the plasma membrane separating it from the interstitial fluid. Water is the largest component of the body, 45 to 75% of our total body mass. Water continuously exchanges between the compartments to maintain an osmotic balance between them. Even though the water constantly moves, the water volume and the solute content in the compartment remain stable. This is what's called fluid balance. So even though water's moving and everything, the it becomes at imbalance so that the size of the cells don't change without our body regulating that. Filtration, reabsorption, diffusion, and osmosis allow continuous exchange of water and solutes among the body fluid compartments. Electrolytes are inorganic compounds that dissociate into ions in the fluid. Electrolyte balance is very closely associated with the fluid balance because where there is a higher concentration of electrolytes, water moves towards that area so the concentrations even out between the two areas. So the electrolyte concentrations cause the water movement or osmosis. Here are the different fluid compartments, and we see how much fluid is found in each one. Actually, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. This is the fluid or the water, the volume of water and how we get it. So the body fluid volume stays about the same because water gain is equal to water loss each day. We gain water by ingestion. So we drink water, we get it in our coffee or soda, and we drink about 1,300 milliliters a day. We also ingest it in foods, which is 700 milliliters a day. So just by what we eat and drink, we're getting 23 milliliters per day. Our body also makes water during aerobic respiration, and that's called metabolic water. And we get about 200 milliliters a day from that. So the total intake on average is 25 milliliters per day. So remember, our overall fluid though we don't become 25 milliliters a day bigger because we lose just about the same amount. The body loses water by mainly urination. 1,500 milliliters are urinated. We also lose it by perspiration through the skin, 600 milliliters. When we exhale, we lose water through our breath, and that's about 300 milliliters a day. And lastly, through our feces, they have 100 milliliters per day. So we gain 2,500 milliliters and we lose 2,500 milliliters. So the regulation of water gain, the level of aerobic respiration determines the volume of metabolic water formed. The amount of water formed is directly proportional to the amount of ATP produced. The other way we regulate water gain is through our thirst center. We have a thirst center in the hypothalamus, which regulates water intake via our need to drink. The term dehydration is when the water loss is greater than water gain. There's a decrease in the volume and an increase in the osmolarity of our body fluids. So we have less fluid, but it is more concentrated. This leads to thirst. This is the thirst response and describes the dehydration properties. Note what signals stimulate the thirst response. So up here we have increased blood osmolarity, so thicker blood, stimulates the osmoreceptors in our hypothalamus, which stimulates the thirst center in the hypothalamus. When we have decreased blood volume, there is decreased activity in the atrial volume receptors. So that stimulates the thirst response, the thirst center. With decreased blood pressure, there is decreased activity in the baroreceptors of the blood vessels and increased release of renin from the kidneys. The baroreceptors in the blood vessels stimulate the thirst center, and the renin causes more angiotensin II formation, which stimulates the thirst center. Also, when our mouth is dry, it also causes our thirst center in the hypothalamus to be activated. That makes us thirsty, which then increases our water intake. The increase in water intake then decreases the blood osmolarity, it becomes more dilute. It also increases the blood volume and the blood pressure and relieves mouth dryness. So how do we regulate water and solute loss? Elimination of excess body water and solutes primarily occurs through urine. The amount of urinary salt loss is the main factor determining our blood volume, our body fluid volume. The two main solutes in extracellular fluid and urine are sodium ions and chloride ions. Wherever solutes go, water follows. So if we regulate the solute concentration, then we in turn regulate the water concentration. The main hormone that regulates the water loss is antidiuretic hormone, ADH, also known as vasopressin. So this is how ADH works. Increased blood osmolarity, again, thicker blood, stimulates the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, which increases the synthesis of ADH by the hypothalamus. That then, when there's more ADH, it increases the release of it from the posterior pituitary. Remember, ADH causes the insertion of the aquaporins in the late distal tubules and collecting ducts of the kidney, so they become more permeable to water. This causes an increase in water reabsorption, which decreases blood osmolarity and increases blood volume and pressure. So ADH helps us to keep water in our blood. So if we have decreased blood volume, that's also going to be triggering this whole set because the atrial volume receptors cause the ADH to be made. Decreased blood pressure is detected by the baroreceptors in our blood vessels, and that also causes ADH production. Other factors like pain, nausea, and stress also causes the synthesis of ADH. So ADH is produced by the hypothalamus, but stored and released by the posterior pituitary. So what stimulates ADH release? We have all of these things up here. How does ADH work? We have it down here. We're putting those new water tunnels, you could say, the aquaporins. It inserts them into the late distal tubules and the collecting ducts. So ADH controls water. There are two major hormones that control the the solute homeostasis, and it is the salt. These, the solutes of sodium and chloride. The first one is aldosterone, and the second is atrial natriuretic peptide. So aldosterone, decreased blood pressure, or having too little sodium in your blood causes the kidneys to release renin, an increased release of this. If more renin is released, more aldosterone is formed. Remember, this is part of the RAS, the renin, aldosterone, angiotensin system. Aldosterone increases sodium reabsorption in the late distal tubules and collecting ducts. Water reabsorption accompanies the sodium reabsorption due to osmosis, because ADH is also released when there is a decrease in blood pressure. The increased sodium reabsorption relieves the sodium deficiency in the blood plasma. The accompanying water reabsorption increases blood volume and blood pressure. How does ANP work? Atrial natriuretic peptide. So this does the opposite. Increased blood volume causes an increased stretch in the atria of the heart. This causes the release of atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP. ANP increases excretion of sodium into the urine. Water excretion in the urine also increases due to osmosis. So where sodium went, water followed. The increase in water excretion causes a decrease in blood volume and blood pressure. All right, how does water move between the body fluid compartments? When the extracellular fluid is isotonic to the cells in the body, The cells do not shrink or swell. Isotonic, if you remember from AMP1, means that the solute concentrations are the same between two different fluids. However, changes in the osmolarity of the extracellular fluids, as what happens in dehydration or overhydration, can cause the cells to either shrink or swell. When we have a high salt diet, the osmolarity of the extracellular fluid increases. Water leaves the cells via osmosis and the cell shrinks. Drinking large volumes of water causes the osmolarity of extracellular fluid to decrease. So we have a hypotonic situation in the extracellular fluid. This causes water to move into the cell via osmosis and the cells to swell. All right, let's move on to electrolytes in our body fluids. Ions are formed when electrolytes dissolve and dissociate. There are four functions for electrolytes. They control the osmosis of water between fluid compartments. They maintain the acid-base balance needed for normal cellular activity. They carry electrical currents to allow action potentials and gradient potentials. And they serve as cofactors for optimal activity of enzymes. Concentrations of ions, is expressed in units of milliequivalents per liter. Blood plasma, interstitial fluid, and intracellular fluid have different concentrations of electrolytes and protein ions. So again, these are the three body fluid compartments we're going to talk about, and we're going to learn what's going on in each one of them as far as different major electrolytes and proteins. When we compare the extracellular fluids, which is blood plasma and interstitial fluid, blood plasma has many protein ions, has many protein anions, and interstitial fluid has only a few. Oops, sorry. So let's look at the body fluid compartments. So remember, we just said extracellular fluid compartments are the blood plasma and the interstitial fluid. And when we look at the different ions, the extracellular fluids kind of stay the same or very similar until we get to the protein anions. And you see blood plasma has many more than interstitial fluid. That's because these protein anions are large and they cannot leave the blood vessels very easily, or they don't at all. So now let's compare the differences in the major ions. So for sodium, we have much more of it outside the cell than inside the cell. Potassium is the opposite. We have much more inside the cell than out. Remember the sodium-potassium pump, and that's kind of the situation our body likes. We notice magnesium is much different here. Intercellular, we have much higher. Phosphate, we have much more inside the cell than outside the cell, and sulfate as well. But we're going to get into more details about these. So sodium is the most abundant cation in our extracellular fluid. It functions in impulse transmission, muscle contraction, fluid and electrolyte balance, because where sodium goes, water is going to follow. Its level is controlled by aldosterone, which causes the sodium reabsorption. ADH, because the lack of ADH permits greater excretion of water and sodium. Excuse me. And then AMP, that causes an increase in sodium excretion. Chloride is the major extracellular anion. It functions to help regulate osmotic pressure between the compartments, and it is part of what's needed to form hydrochloric acid in the stomach. Regulation of chloride balance in the body fluids is controlled by ADH regulating water loss through the urine. Aldosterone regulates sodium reabsorption, and chlorine follows sodium due to the electrical attraction between the positive and the negative ions. All right, potassium. This is the most abundant cation in intracellular fluid. The functions is involved in fluid volume, impulse conduction, muscle contraction, and regulation of our pH. The amount of potassium is regulated by mineralocorticoids, mainly aldosterone. The next electrolyte part is the bicarbonate ion. It is a very important blood plasma ion. It functions as the major member of the plasma acid-base buffer system. And we'll get into buffers in just at the end of this chapter. Kidneys reabsorb or secrete it for the final acid-base balance of the blood. Calcium is the most abundant mineral in the body, and it's mainly an extracellular cation. It's the structural component of bones and teeth. It's used for blood coagulation, neurotransmitter release, muscle tone, excitability of our nerves and muscles. Calcium is regulated by the parathyroid hormone, PTH, which enhances the renal absorption of calcium. And calcitriol, it promotes the absorption of calcium in our digestive tract. Phosphate. Phosphate occurs primarily as a calcium phosphate salt. It's used in a buffer system and regulated by parathyroid hormone, which inhibits the renal reabsorption of phosphate, and calcitriol, which promotes its absorption in the GI tract. So this is interesting because it's going to be reabsorbed, or I'm sorry, it's going to be absorbed greatly in the digestive tract. And then when parathyroid hormone also then causes us to just urinate it out because it's inhibiting the reabsorption of it back into our blood. Magnesium is an intracellular cation and functions to activate enzymes involved in carbohydrate and protein metabolism. It also is used in myocardial function, the transmission in the central nervous system, and in the operation of the sodium pump. All right, so that's our electrolytes. Let's move on to the acid-base balance. The pH of arterial blood ranges from 7.35 to 7.45. This is a range you're going to want to keep in your long-term memory, okay? There are three mechanisms to keep the pH at this range. There are buffer systems. These act quickly. They temporarily bind the excess hydrogen ions. So they help to raise the pH, but they don't remove the hydrogen ions from the blood. Exhalation of carbon dioxide. So when we breathe out, we exhale carbon dioxide, and that reduces the carbonic acid in our blood, which then gets rid of the excess acidity. Okay, so if we increase how quickly how often we breathe and how deep we breathe, then we're going to exhale more carbon dioxide. Exhaling more of it reduces the carbonic acid in our blood, and that causes an increase in pH. So increased pH is, if you remember, means something becomes more basic or alkaline. A lower pH is more acidic. And then we can also just excrete hydrogen ions through our urine. This is the slowest mechanism, and it's the only way to eliminate the acids other than carbonic acid. So every other acid we can't get rid of it via exhalation, and the buffers just kind of ties it up but doesn't remove it. Oops. So whoops, what happened here? Buffer systems. So this is our first method. They prevent rapid, drastic changes in pH of body fluids. They convert strong acids and bases into weak acids and weak bases, which affect the pH much less. There are three main buffer systems that I'm going to discuss. The first is the protein buffer system. It's most abundant in intracellular fluid, like hemoglobin and red blood cells, and blood plasma, where albumin is going to be the major protein buffer system. A structure of protein has at least one carboxyl group, which is a C, OO, and H, and has at least one amino group, which is NH2. When the pH rises, so we're getting too basic or too alkaline, an H plus is released from the carboxyl group to decrease the pH. So this is how it buffers it. Something happens, the pH starts to get higher and higher. So the proteins will buffer this by releasing an H plus, as we see here, and that's going to then decrease the pH because that is what pH measures. So here is an example of the protein. It has a C, this is the carboxyl group. In a basic environment, it will lose the H in order to keep the pH of the solution in homeostasis. Now, when the pH falls, which means it's getting too acidic, we need to get rid of some of the H's in the solution. The free amino group, the NH2, combines with the excess H to form NH3. And that increases the fluid's pH, which restores it back into a normal range. So hemoglobin in our red blood cells acts as a buffer for carbonic acid. So in our red blood cells, we're going to take in some carbon dioxide and get rid of the oxygen that it's carrying, right? So carbon dioxide comes in the red blood cells and combines with water to create carbonic acid. We don't want too much carbonic acid because that's going to lower our pH of the blood. The carbonic acid dissociates into hydrogen and bicarb. So now we got a lot of hydrogen ions, which we don't want. So here comes hemoglobin. It's bringing the oxygen, so it's oxyhemoglobin, and it's going to deliver the oxygen. So after delivering the oxygen, the hemoglobin picks up the excess H plus, and that helps to buffer the pH. So the hemoglobin delivers the oxygen right here, and it then can bond with the hydrogen, and now it restores that pH. The second buffer system is the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. So bicarbonate ion, HCO3-, acts as a weak base, and carbonic acid, H2CO3, acts as a weak acid. So the acidic condition, we would have excess H+, but we have HCO3- hanging around. So it can combine with that H+ and take it out of solution, okay? And that's going to cause the pH to go back to normal. So if the pH falls, bicarbonate ion removes it, okay? It's going to take that out of solution and bring it back a little bit. When the solution becomes too basic or alkaline, the carbonic acid will then dissociate and release H+ into solution, which causes the pH to then decrease to a normal range. So when pH rises, carbonic acid can provide the H+. The last buffer system is the phosphate buffer system. It acts similarly to the carbonic acid bicarb buffer system. Dihydrogen phosphate, which is H2PO4-, and monohydrogen phosphate, HPO4-2-, are the ions in the system. So when the fluid is too basic, there is usually a strong base there, which would have an OH-. So we need to get rid of some of that. The dihydrogen phosphate can combine, it will donate the H from it to the OH to create water, leaving the monohydrogen phosphate. So it helps to buffer that strong base. Now, in acidic conditions, we have excess H+. In this case, the monohydrogen phosphate combines with the H plus to create that dihydrogen phosphate, essentially preventing that decrease in pH. So HPO4 2- acts as a weak base, combining with the excess H plus to lower the pH. The second mechanism our body uses is the exhalation of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide mixes with water in the blood to form carbonic acid. So here's the equation. Carbon dioxide and water makes carbonic acid, but carbonic acid can dissociate into a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion. When we exhale carbon dioxide more frequently or at a greater depth, it leads to less acid production. And that then it causes a rise in pH. Exhaling carbon dioxide less frequently and or at a lesser depth leads to more acid production, and that causes a drop in the pH. So here is the negative feedback system with the carbonic acid bicarbonate ion. I'm sorry, I just said that wrong. This is the negative feedback system for exhaling carbon dioxide. So, and it talks about that the pH of our body fluid actually affects how quickly we breathe and how deep we breathe. So say there is some condition that causes the pH to decrease. So we're getting too acidic. Central chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata and peripheral chemoreceptors in the aortic and carotid bodies detect the change. It sends that information to the dorsal respiratory group in the medulla, which sends impulses to the diaphragm. It causes the diaphragm to contract more forcefully and frequently, causing more carbon dioxide to be exhaled. As less carbonic acid is formed and fewer hydrogen ions are present, the blood pH increases. This then restores homeostasis to the blood pH, and then we go back to normal. The last way we can regulate the fluid pH is through excretion by the kidneys. Metabolic reactions produce acids, and pH is controlled by excreting H plus in the urine. The proximal convoluted tubules and the collecting ducts of the kidneys secrete H plus into the tubular fluid. Sodium hydrogen antiporters in the proximal convoluted tubules secrete hydrogen as they reabsorb sodium. Proton pumps in the intercalated cells of the collecting duct secrete H plus in the tubular fluid. Okay. All right, so what happens when there are imbalances? Acidosis is when the blood pH is below 7.35. Generally, it causes a depression of the central nervous system. Alkalosis is when the blood pH is above 7.45 and we see nervous system excitability. Our body can produce compensation. These are physiological responses to an acid-base imbalance that act to normalize the blood pH. Complete compensation is the activities that return the blood pH to a normal range. It's called partial compensation when the blood pH is still not within 7.35 or 7.45. So we can have respiratory compensation. So we have a problem with the pH of the blood, and our body can change the rate and the depth of breathing to combat the pH changes due to some sort of metabolic cause. So if there is a problem in the pH due to a respiratory cause, you're not going to have respiratory compensation. You're going to have metabolic compensation, which we'll get to. But if there's a metabolic cause for the change in pH, then our body responds in some sort of respiratory change. So this begins within minutes with a maximum effectiveness within hours. Renal compensation is changing the secretion of H+ and the reabsorption of HCO3- by the kidney to combat the pH changes due to some sort of respiratory cause. This begins within minutes and its maximum effectiveness takes days. All right, so respiratory acidosis is when the blood pH drops due to retention of carbon dioxide, leading to excess carbonic acid. And this is because you're not able to breathe out enough carbon dioxide. Respiratory alkalosis is when the pH rises due to excessive loss of carbon dioxide, as in hyperventilation. Metabolic acidosis is when the blood levels of HCO3- falls, and metabolic alkalosis is when the blood levels of HCO3- raises. If you could please pause the video right now and watch this video called The Regulation of pH, and then come on back. Okay, so if you're back, this is the end of our lecture. If you have any questions, please send me an email, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great week.